What if I told you that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one screaming for attention, but the quiet one in the corner? The one who's been pushed too far too often. Stay with me, because what Carl Jung discovered about human psychology will completely change the way you see empaths forever. Jung believed that every individual carries both light and shadow within them. But in the misunderstood empath, this inner duality burns brighter than most people can handle. Society tends to confuse empathy with weakness, assuming that someone who feels deeply must be easy to break. But Jung's research revealed something much more complex and far more terrifying. Because the empath isn't weak, they're holding back. The human psyche operates on layers. According to Jung, the persona, our public mask, often hides our true nature. But what happens when someone with extraordinary emotional intelligence removes that mask? That's where the shadow self emerges, and what Jung uncovered about the shadow will shock you. Consider this. While others learn social cues through trial and error, empaths absorb emotional data like sophisticated radar systems. They don't just notice microexpressions, they decode the entire emotional landscape of a room within moments. This isn't a gift, it's a survival mechanism developed through necessity. Empaths live in what Jung called the tension of opposites. They feel pain intensely, yet they manage to contain it. They detect deception, yet continue to hope for the best in people. This isn't naivety, it's what Jung called the transcendent function. The rare ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously. But this ability comes at a cost. And for narcissists, it's a silent warning, because the empath who has endured betrayal, manipulation, and emotional violence doesn't stay naive. They evolve. Jung observed that most people spend their lives avoiding psychological growth. They prefer comfortable illusions to painful truths. But empaths don't have that luxury. Their heightened sensitivity forces them into what Jung termed active individuation, the conscious confrontation with their own psychological depths. This process isn't gentle. It's what Jung called the night sea journey, a descent into the unconscious that strips away everything false, everything borrowed, everything that isn't authentically theirs. Jung said that the most psychologically integrated people are those who face their own shadow and emerged whole. Empaths go through this crucible far earlier and more violently than most. Their emotional wounds force them to grow faster, deeper, and more consciously. They don't just understand light. They've met darkness face to face and survived it. That's where narcissists make their fatal mistake. They see the empath as kindness and assume it means weakness. They believe they can control someone so emotionally open. But what Jung discovered is that those who lead with love often possess the strongest psychological architecture. Why? Because they had no choice. They had to build it brick by brick just to make it through. Here's what most people miss. Empaths don't start as victims. They begin as natural healers, drawn to wounded people like moths to flame. But repeated exposure to psychological toxicity creates what Jung called compensatory reactions in the unconscious mind. The empath begins cataloging patterns, not consciously at first, but their psyche starts building what Jung termed complexes, autonomous psychological clusters that process and store traumatic emotional data. These complexes don't make them weaker. They make them incredibly perceptive. Jung's theory of individuation teaches that every person must one day confront their true, authentic self. For most people, that process is slow, if it ever happens at all. But for the empath, betrayal accelerates the journey. Pain becomes a catalyst for psychological rebirth. This is the part most people never see coming. Emotional sensitivity isn't fragility, it's advanced pattern recognition. Empaths don't just feel emotions, they decode them. They analyze them. They remember every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. Jung wrote about what he called active imagination, the conscious dialogue with unconscious contents. Empaths develop this naturally, while others suppress painful memories empaths integrate them. They don't just survive trauma, they transform it into wisdom. And once enough of that data accumulates, something happens. What Jung called the emergence of the self, the totalized personality that transcends the ego's limitations. At that point, nothing can stop them. Carl Jung observed that the most powerful transformations happen not in safety, but in crisis. He called it enantiodromia, the idea that when something is pushed to its extreme, it turns into its opposite. So the empath who is endlessly patient becomes immovable. The one who gave without limits becomes highly selective. The one who forgave everything begins to walk away for good. This isn't cruelty, it's clarity. Jung taught that true strength is born when we integrate our shadow. When we stop denying our boundaries and start honoring them, the empath doesn't lose their heart. They gain a spine. But there's something deeper happening here. Jung discovered that the psyche has what he called a self-regulating function. When a conscious mind becomes too one-sided, the unconscious compensates. The empath who gives everything away eventually develops what Jung termed counterattitudes, psychological forces that demand balance. This isn't conscious rebellion. It's the psyche's wisdom asserting itself. The empath begins saying no not because they've become selfish, but because their deeper self demands integration. Here's what will truly blow your mind. Once the empath awakens to their power, they don't just heal themselves, they change everything around them. The narcissist games no longer work. The emotional traps no longer land. The mask drops, and the empath rises fully aware of who they are and what they deserve. According to Jung, there's a profound difference between being unconsciously reactive and being consciously responsive. Most people live out of their wounds. They lash out. They seek revenge. They try to hurt others the way they were once hurt. But a transformed empath, someone who has passed through the fire and emerged aware, doesn't operate like that. They act from what Jung called conscious choice. They don't need to destroy the person who betrayed them because they've already fought and won a much harder battle, the one within themselves. Jung observed that psychological development follows what he called the spiral path. We don't move in straight lines. We revisit the same themes at deeper levels. The awakened empath has spiraled through betrayal, manipulation, and emotional abuse multiple times. Each cycle stripped away another layer of illusion until only truth remained. Jung said, "The greatest victory isn't conquering others. It's conquering the parts of yourself that would pull you down to their level." This is where the narcissist finally realizes their mistake. Manipulators depend on predictable reactions. They want you to chase, to explain, to beg, to argue, to keep playing the game. But when an empath reaches what Jung called psychological autonomy, that game ends entirely. Jung discovered that the most powerful position in any dynamic is not control through dominance. It's detachment born from understanding. Not silence out of fear, but stepping back because you've seen the truth so clearly you no longer need the noise. The awakened empath doesn't retreat because they're wounded. They retreat because they're finished. And this is the moment where everything you thought you knew about power starts to shift. What Jung called active withdrawal isn't passive aggression. It's conscious disengagement from psychological systems that no longer serve growth. The empath stops feeding dysfunction with their attention, their energy, their presence. According to Jung's research on psychological types, empaths possess what he called feeling function dominance. But don't confuse this with emotional instability. It's actually emotional precision. The ability to sense inconsistencies, detect manipulation before it fully forms, and intuit what others try to hide. Jung identified 4 psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Most people develop 1 or 2 strongly, but empaths often develop what Jung called auxiliary function sophistication, the ability to access multiple functions simultaneously. They think with their feelings and feel with their thoughts. They sense patterns intuitively and trust their intuitive sensations. This creates what Jung termed psychological flexibility, the capacity to adapt their responses to different situations with surgical precision. But here's the twist Jung identified. When that emotional intelligence fuses with hard-won wisdom, it creates something extraordinary. The empath stops being reactive and becomes strategic. They no longer act from pain, they begin to move from power. The transformation that follows isn't just rare, it's revolutionary. Jung called this the marriage of opposites. When feeling and thinking, intuition and sensation, conscious and unconscious unite in service of the integrated self. Jung had a name for this evolution, the transcendent function. It's the capacity to hold inner tension without breaking, to see darkness without becoming bitter, to feel everything and still choose clarity over chaos. When an empath survives betrayal after betrayal and doesn't harden but refines, this transcendent function develops at a level most people never reach. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming whole, complete unto yourself. The individuated empath no longer seeks validation from others to feel real. They trust their perceptions without needing outside approval. They stop chasing love from people who can't even recognize depth. They stop performing empathy for people who never reciprocated it. Jung wrote about what he called psychological mirroring. Empaths naturally reflect the emotional projections of those around them. That's why people feel seen in their presence. But when an empath has been repeatedly used, manipulated, and betrayed, something changes. They stop reflecting and start revealing. They no longer absorb dysfunction. They see through the charm, the fake apologies, the cycles of guilt and control, and they reflect it all back. Not with anger, but with truth. And truth, Jung discovered, is the most destructive force against deception. Then comes what Jung called the return of the repressed. When someone suppresses their true self, their true boundaries, their true power, eventually it doesn't explode, it emerges. But not in rage, in clarity. The empath who once accommodated everyone becomes still and immovable. They no longer debate, they decide. They don't over-explain, they act. They don't rescue what's broken. They exit the story entirely. This isn't cruelty. This is individuation in motion. This is the moment Jung warned us about. When someone integrates their shadow, owns their worth, and reclaims their sovereignty. Jung discovered that the unconscious mind has what he called prospective function. It not only stores past experiences, but anticipates future possibilities. The awakened empath's unconscious has been preparing for this moment of integration throughout every betrayal, every manipulation, every moment of being underestimated. Here's the final revelation. The shadow isn't just made of darkness. It's also made of unlived potential. The empath's true power was never in their gentleness alone. It was in everything they never allowed themselves to become until now. For empaths, the shadow doesn't just contain rage or pain. It holds something even more powerful: boundaries, the ability to say no, the strength to walk away, and betrayal. That's the trigger that forces them to integrate those parts of themselves they once hid in the name of peace. Carl Jung discovered that integrating the shadow doesn't make someone colder, it makes them wiser. Empaths don't stop caring. They begin choosing more carefully where that care flows. They realize their empathy isn't something to be spilled everywhere. It's sacred. It must be earned. Jung wrote about what he called active love versus passive love. Passive love gives indiscriminately, hoping to be loved in return. Active love chooses consciously, establishing reciprocity as a foundation for genuine connection. What emerges next is what Jung called the individuated self, and it is unstoppable. Carl Jung once said that the most dangerous individuals are not those who act out of unhealed wounds, but those who've transformed their wounds into wisdom. This is the awakened empath. They've seen cruelty, endured betrayal, and instead of breaking, they refined. They understand manipulation because they've survived it. They recognize gaslighting because they've escaped it. They can sense emotional predators because they've been preyed upon. This isn't paranoia. It's what Jung called hard-earned discernment. And this is where the shift becomes permanent. According to Jung's theory of psychological development, there comes a moment in a person's evolution when they stop chasing completion in others and instead become whole within themselves. For the empath who's been betrayed, this moment isn't just healing, it's revolutionary. They no longer seek approval. They stop justifying their boundaries. They stop apologizing for their needs. They reach what Jung described as psychological sovereignty, complete ownership of their emotional reality. The final transformation is something else entirely. Jung called it the return to the self. It's magnificent because real strength isn't the absence of feeling, it's sensitivity refined through wisdom. The fully awakened empath is the embodiment of this paradox. They still feel deeply, but now they love selectively. They still understand completely, but they engage cautiously. They still forgive, but they no longer forget. Jung believed the most integrated individuals are those who can hold both light and shadow in full awareness. The transformed empath has learned to be soft with those who deserve it and sharp with those who demand it. They've mastered what Jung called appropriate response, no longer reacting from pain, but acting from clarity. Jung's concept of psychological types reveals that empaths often possess what he called superior function differentiation. They've developed their natural gifts to an extraordinary degree while also integrating their inferior functions through necessity. This creates what Jung termed psychological completeness, not perfection, but wholeness. The ability to access the full spectrum of human psychological capacity as situations demand. Here's the final truth that makes them untouchable. According to Jung, the highest form of psychological development is when a person no longer needs others to complete them. The empath reaches this not through detachment, but through integration. They don't become whole by shutting the world out. They become whole by choosing their place in it with surgical precision. They no longer rescue people who enjoy drowning. They no longer chase those who choose to run. They no longer pour their soul into black holes disguised as people. They've mastered what Jung called the art of conscious relationship, engaging only where there's mutual respect, reciprocity, and genuine care. And once an empath reaches this level, no one, not a manipulator, not a narcissist, not even their own past, can touch them again. The end result is something Carl Jung called the individuated empath, and they're the most powerful force you'll ever encounter. Jung said that when someone integrates their shadow, confronts their inner demons, and emerges whole, they become what he called a force of nature, not violent, not loud, but utterly unshakable. The fully awakened empath doesn't seek revenge because they've grown beyond the need for it. They don't beg for validation because they know their worth like it's carved into their bones. They don't fear solitude because they've become the kind of person they want to be alone with. They become what Jung described as psychologically complete, not perfect, but fully awake. These individuals have taken their deepest wounds and turned them into their strongest weapons. They're dangerous, not because they destroy, but because they can't be destroyed anymore. Not manipulated, not controlled, not broken. Jung discovered that true psychological power doesn't come from dominating others. It comes from what he called self-possession. The awakened empath possesses themselves so completely that external manipulation becomes impossible. According to everything Carl Jung uncovered about human nature, is the single most terrifying thing a narcissist can face. Someone who has learned to love themselves as fiercely as they once loved others. This is the empath's true journey, from victim to sovereign. And it's not just healing, it's what Jung called the hero's journey of the psyche. A sacred descent into the dark, a confrontation with every shadow, a reclamation of forgotten power, and a rebirth that's not just emotional but spiritual. Jung discovered that suffering, when embraced with consciousness, becomes the raw material of wisdom. And the empath, the one who walked through fire, doesn't just survive. They become the light that guides others through their own darkness. They are living proof of Jung's most powerful truth. Within every wound lies the seed of transcendence. Within every betrayal lives the invitation to become whole. But there's one more layer Jung identified that most people never reach. He called it active compassion, the ability to feel deeply for others while maintaining complete psychological boundaries. The individuated empath achieves this paradox. They can witness suffering without becoming it. They can offer help without losing themselves. They can love without attachment and engage without enmeshment. This is what Jung called conscious participation in life, being fully present while remaining psychologically sovereign. The awakened empath doesn't withdraw from the world. They engage with it from a place of strength rather than need. They offer their gifts freely, but never at the expense of their integrity. They've learned what Jung called the middle way, neither complete withdrawal nor complete absorption, but conscious choice in every moment. This is the psychology of the awakened empath. And once you understand it, you'll never again underestimate the quiet strength of someone who's turned their pain into power, their wounds into wisdom, and their deepest suffering into their greatest strength. If this message moved something in you, remember that the empath doesn't just survive betrayal. They rise from it, transformed into something the world desperately needs. Living proof that love and strength are not opposites, but partners in the dance of psychological wholeness.